All right. Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lichi. I'm one of the organizers for this year's Quantitative Seminar series for the Pump Lab. I'll start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all bands and tribes in the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Our lab also acknowledges that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. And now to introduce our speaker, Juan Carlos Villaseñor-Derbez is a postdoctoral researcher with the McKelly Lab at Stanford University, and will be joining the University of Miami as an assistant professor in 2024. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Oceanography from Universidad Autónoma de Baja California in Mexico. Sorry, it's been a long morning. And a master's and PhD in environmental science and management from UC Santa Barbara. He studies coupled human-marine systems through the lens of marine conservation and resource management. He is broadly interested in understanding how humans use the marine environment, how they respond to environmental change and policy interventions, and how these responses shape environmental and economic outcomes. To answer these questions, he combines ecological and economic theory with geospatial, big data, and econometric techniques. Juan Carlos will take questions as we go. And so thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to our speaker for sharing your work with us today. And so I'll turn it over to you, Juan Carlos.
Thanks, Lichi. Just making sure everyone can hear me still in the room, because I moved some things into my settings, but if that works, that works. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm actually really excited as someone who tangentially touches and works in fisheries, being invited to the SAF's Quant seminar. It's like, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting good feedback from fishery scientists, people who actually work in that discipline, not me who just sort of like takes bits and pieces of it to try and understand other types of processes. Before I start, I have a couple of notes just to remind myself of some things that I want to get over with, because otherwise I'm going to forget to do it while I'm presenting. One is that both of the pieces that I'll be presenting today are works in progress. So that means it hasn't been peer-reviewed. There could still be a misplaced comma somewhere in the code that is throwing everything incorrectly. And that is important because some of my co-authors haven't seen the latest version of these results that I'm going to present here. So if you see any mistakes, any errors, any horrible things, that's all on me. If you think the science is fabulous and sound and solid, then it's a group effort, right? Just don't blame it on my co-authors because they're not aware of some of these latest results. Please feel free to interrupt, whether it's with clarifying questions, with questions in general, with anything. I would rather have these be sort of like a back and forth conversation than just like me talking for 45 minutes to an hour. And I'm hoping, depending on how much interruption, how much feedback we have, to show two different pieces. One of them on fuel subsidies in the industrial fisheries in Mexico, and the second one about marine heat waves in small-scale fisheries in Mexico, specifically along the Baja California Peninsula. And one last thing is that all of the data that I will be using and presenting today comes from a recent weird but very welcome push in Mexican government agencies and Mexican science agencies on making data publicly available. That's great because a bunch of data we didn't even know existed is slowly trickling down, and like it just sometimes pops up on some government website and you download it and save it to your hard drive, hoping that they will never delete it from the website, but you want to have it. Those data are not particularly clean, but they are publicly available. So if anybody wants to use them, they are there. It's not like they're only available to Mexicans. So if you have good projects in mind or whatever, you can use it. And what I'm showing you here is a messy workflow of me trying to attempt to clean and standardize a lot of these different disparate data sets. And it includes anything from the vessel registry to different spatial features of interest. The Mexican VMS data is publicly available in the government website, but it's like raw data. It's not Global Fishing Watch processed or anything like that. and landings. There's over 2 decades of landings by vessel, by trip, that are now available. And of course, there's a lot of caveats on quality and quantity of the data. But all this is to say is that if any of the data that I present today sparks something in your imagination and you're like, oh, I would like to do something with those data, let me know and I can either point you in the direction of the openly raw data or give you the clean version of the data that I have. All that I ask in return is that you do something with it. And you need not include me as a co-author. I do not believe in that. The data are there. You should use them. They should be used to advance knowledge. With those things out of the way, Lychee briefly mentioned sort of like how I approach my research topics, but I want to give you a little bit of an overview, mostly so that you know where my scientific bias might come from, why I don't consider myself a fishery scientist, and why I use a certain set of tools and techniques, and along with that some lingo that I'll try to clarify as best as I go through the presentation. I am broadly interested in how humans respond to environmental change and policy interventions. What drives these responses, right? What are the behavioral margins that drive people to make a choice, or a group of fishers to make a choice? And how these responses in turn feed back into the system, right? So I'm focusing on a couple human marine systems, not only fisheries, but also conservation, shipping, health, nutrition, things like that. For the bulk of my research, I use remotely sensed products to track humans at sea, either VMS or AIS data, so vessel monitoring systems or automatic identification systems, or remote sensing data of the marine environment itself. And that includes, all the suite of Modi's Aqua Terra products kind of thing, and long-term in situ observations, either underwater ecological surveys or at the dock, measurements of landing data and things like that. But because I'm interested in the policy side of things, I usually bring in at least one sort of administrative data set that introduces a policy or that introduces some variation in how humans are allowed to behave, right? And that is how I exploit some sort of variation that I take it as if it were random to try to understand how the behavioral responses feed back into the system. And like you might all imagine, all of this is done on a suite of sort of cloud computing, scripting languages, and relational data tables. So to start with the first part, this work is was part of like a side project during my PhD. It wasn't part of my dissertation. It was like a little fun thing to do on the side with Chris Costello and Olivier Deschênes, both at the Brent School and the Econ Department at UC Santa Barbara, and was funded by the Pew Charitable Trust as part of their focus group on fuel subsidies reforms and helping the World Trade Organization lead the policy on reforming subsidies. So to begin with, I'm going to briefly give a few definitions just to ground exactly what we're going to be talking about. A fishery subsidy is simply a financial contribution, a monetary transfer from a government to the fishing industry or to the fishing sector. It can take many different forms, right? It can be anything from paying to develop a new port, for example here, or fuel subsidies. Most, if not all, coastal nations have some form of subsidies where rather than allowing the fishers as a producting sector to finance themselves, whatever project or activity is, they are transferring money from taxpayers, basically. And this is seen as a leading cause of overfishing, right? It increases capacity. If the government gives you a bigger vessel, you're maybe going to fish more. If they give you free fuel, you're maybe going to fish more. And this has prompted calls for subsidy reforms, both at the World Trade Organization and at the United Nations in a suite of different sustainable development goals and different agreements and targets. Now, the most important thing is that we have a very limited understanding of the potential upside from a subsidy reform, right? While the theory tells us, yes, probably if fuel were free, I would fish more than I do now, right? We don't know exactly how much more. Yes, if I have a bigger engine, I might be able to go further out. Or if you give me a free net to replace my rackety old net, I might catch more, right? But we have a very limited understanding of exactly how much benefit are we expecting to see from those changes. And as you can see here in this plot from the latest assessment by the group of Scarrett, the largest amount of money spent on subsidizing fisheries is through fuel. And that takes many different forms, but it's through fuel, essentially. So the main results of this piece, I'm going to ask, what can we expect from reforming fuel subsidies specifically, right? I'm going to focus on fuel subsidies only. And I'm going to ask, in the context of the Mexican shrimp trawl fleet, how much fishing, in quotes here, is attributable to fuel subsidies. And I'm using fishing in quotes because I'm going to be looking at different measures of it, both on, the classic joke of they call it fishing, not catching, because those are two different things. So the hours spent fishing, the amount of area that you're using to fish, but also how much you're catching, right? But that's why in quotations. And I'm going to show you that about 22% of the fishing activity in terms of hours is attributable to the fuel subsidies, that there isn't a real or a significant or a clear change in the extent of fishing grounds. So people fish more in given places rather than search for new places. And that it accounts for about 53% of landings. So when vessels are subsidized, they fish harder and spend more time, and that leads to increase in landings. And perhaps more importantly, we can estimate an elasticity and measure that a 1% increase in subsidy will lead to about a 0.1% increase in activity as measured by hours. And I'll show you also the measurements for area and landings, but those are the key points here. And then I'll delve into where we would expect to see these changes, because if we establish that they are not really fishing elsewhere or expanding their fishing grounds, but just simply fishing more in given places, we can try to understand the spatial heterogeneity of subsidies, and where should you remove or reduce subsidies, you would expect to see some gains. Basically, if you were to overlap that with stock boundaries, you could have an idea of how fishing mortality will change if you were to reduce or eliminate subsidies in Mexico. So I'm going to briefly walk through Econ 101 charts on how fuel subsidies might incentivize overfishing. And in this sense, I'm using the word overfishing as more fishing than you would have otherwise. It has nothing to do with any management reference point, with any sense of optimality, other than for a given price, I am willing to fish a given amount, right? And so the price is the y-axis here, the horizontal line, that's the price in pesos per liter or dollars per liter. And the x-axis is the number of liters. So for a given price, I am willing to fish L or to spend L star liters of fuel. If I were to receive a price subsidy, let's say instead of paying P star, I have to pay PS. For example, I don't have to pay a sales tax on the fuel that I buy, as it's done in some countries. Then you would expect to fish more than that, right? Because that horizontal price line is intersecting my demand for fuel or my marginal benefits curve at an outward point. So you would say, well, for this amount of subsidy, you would get this amount of additional fishing. And I'm using the term additional fishing, that's sort of like the measure of overfishing, the more than you would have otherwise. Has nothing to do with any management reference point. Now, another option is for nations to subsidize using a stepped pricing, right? This is the equivalent of saying your first 50 liters, you're going to pay $1 per liter, but then after that, you have to pay the market price. If you set that up, in theory, you're not changing and provided that the kink is low enough, you are not changing the point at which the marginal price, the market price, intersects your line, and you shouldn't expect to see an increase in fishing effort, right? Or in fuel consumption in this case. And this is in fact how Mexico subsidizes its fisheries. They have a whole formula, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, that determines, given your vessel characteristics and your fishery, how much subsidy in liters you're entitled for, and how much pesos per liter you're going to be given for free. Now, there are at least a few reasons why even this setup, where the government is basically paying for the dark gray box, could incentivize overfishing. One way that has been shown to actually occur in electricity markets, where we have a stepped pricing, right? Like the first kilowatt hours are priced differently than the next kilowatt hours, but we don't see that, right? You don't make your marginal decisions by looking at your meter every day, right? You simply, at the end of the month, say, oh, actually, I consumed this much. and I paid this much, so therefore the average price divide one by the other, and that's how much I paid. And you might make your decisions for the next month based on that average price in your mind. And that is what this gray line is showing you here. There are a few reasons why that line might occur. One of them is this averaging effect, right? That you look back and say, well, how much did I consume? How much did I spend? And take the average of those two. If there is uncertainty around your consumption, that could also occur, right? If you're not sure how much you're going to consume and whether you're going to overshoot or not, that could be a way in which you perceive the price. And a third way in which even a block subsidy like this could induce overfishing is if you're capital limited or capital constrained, right? So even if the price is blue, the blue line, and the optimal amount of liters to spend is L star, you might not be able to afford that, right? You might not have enough money to buy that much fuel, so you fish less than that. But if you get a government outlay in the size of this box deposited into your bank account, because that's how it works in Mexico, you might end up buying more fuel and you might end up fishing more. So let me walk you quickly through how Mexico defines or decides how much to subsidize. And I'm going to be using this part again because it very clearly outlines the length or the subsidized amount in liters and the subsidized price, so the height of the dark gray rectangle. The formula they publish every year on their, it's called a Norma Oficial Mexicana, it's like a normal, an official Mexican norm that gets updated every year, says that the length of that, the number of liters that you will receive a subsidy for vessel I at time T, are a combination of the days per cycle. So in this case, I'm showing you a screenshot of the table that's published in the norm that says if you participate in the shrimp fishery in the Pacific, you're allowed to legally operate for 190 days. So we know that you're only going to be out at sea 190 days. And then they have this MDL, the maximum daily liters, that they have a table, which I'm showing you here as a graph, but they have a table that says for every single bin of engine power size, how much liters we expect you to burn if you're fishing the entire day, right? And so if you multiply those two things, in principle, you would get an estimation of how much total fuel you're expected to consume through the cycle of 190 days. So that's going to tell us the total length from the origin to how much you're expected to consume, just if you were fishing for 190 days. And then they have an adjustment factor that varies in principle by year, because every year they update what that adjustment factor is. And the idea of this adjustment factor is to make sure that nobody gets a full ride, basically, right? Looking at historical records, it usually varies between 0.4 and 0.7. So between 40 and 70% of your expected fuel consumption is going to be subsidized at a given price. So this formula tells us the length. And then the height of that says it can be up to 2 pesos per liter. For reference, fuel today in Mexico is around 23 pesos per liter, so it's about a 10% subsidy, right? You can think of it simply that way. Now, there are two caveats. The adjustment factor that it gets published every year says that each local office, think about as regional management offices, has the ability to downward adjust the adjustment factor in order to make sure that they have enough money, right? Basically, based on budgetary constraints. And they can say, well, not only you're going to get maybe 50% instead of 70%, but you're going to get it at 1 peso per liter instead of 2 pesos per liter. The maximum is set by the norm, but each office can adjust downward. And so this variation is going to turn out to produce some variation in how much subsidy people get. The second way is that bureaucracy is key. The second way in which we're going to have variation is that bureaucracy is key. I'm showing you here a very messy flow chart. This is from the 2011 norm, and this flow chart is updated every year, showing all the steps that a fisher has to go through if they want to get a subsidy, right? If you think that's confusing, that's fine. That's the purpose of it. I'm just showing you so you're confused and you understand that there are many times where you can actually screw something up in your paperwork, and maybe you failed to file form -3005, and just because of that, you're no longer eligible to receive a subsidy, right? Things that are totally random, or not totally random, but not correlated at least with your fuel consumption and your fishing ability. So vessels have to self-select into treatment and be admitted into the roster, because CONAPESCA, the fisheries management agency, maintains a roster of eligibility. Once you're in the roster, you're pretty much safe. Every 1 to 2 years, you need to say, yes, I still want my subsidy, but other than that, you're in. If you're out of the roster, you're constantly applying to be admitted into the roster, and you will only be admitted if someone else drops out. Someone else might drop out if they fail to report their landings, if their VMS transponder either goes dark or they cannot prove that it was malfunctioning, or some irregularities with their VMS transponder. If you fail to say that you still want the subsidy, this is basically a way for them to account for deceased people, because the money is available in a plastic credit card, and if it's not used, they'll take it back. And if after a few years you don't manifest that you want to still get the subsidy, they assume you're dead or no longer interested, and they take you out. So that opens up a spot, and someone else can jump in. Or if you receive other subsidies. So, for example, there's different programs in Mexico. Some of them give you new boats or new engines, or vessel buyback programs. So if you participate in those, you're not eligible for a fuel subsidy. So we're going to be focusing on a subset of vessels, of shrimp trawlers that have never received any other subsidy, that have VMS transponders, which is helpful because we're going to be able to track them, and that continuously report their landings. But importantly, some of them, we observe them even before they were admitted into the roster, and they're only admitted once someone else drops out. And of course, if you break the law, you're also kicked out of the subsidy. Or, importantly, even if you're in the roster, they can say, yes, you will get a subsidy, and your subsidy is $0.00. Right? That is a possibility in the framework. And they actually send letters saying this. Yes, your subsidy is 0.00. And you're like, okay, great. So all this is to show you that there is considerable variation in Mexico's fuel subsidy program. So what I'm showing you here is a time series or charts showing you the number of economic units that are subsidized in any given year in blue, or not subsidized in red. And an economic unit, you can think of it as a tax-paying fishing agency or entity, right? It sometimes might be a single fisher that has its boat, and that's an economic unit. It sometimes might be a fishing conglomerate with 20 boats, and that's a fishing, an economic unit under Mexican regulation. And you see that there's a huge drop in 2014, where a bunch of vessels did not receive a subsidy. And that was a case of, here, your subsidy is 0.00. And that happened because in 2014, Mexico decided to put a lot of money towards aquaculture subsidies instead of fuel subsidies in fisheries. And you see that year to year, the amount of budget that's available for fuel subsidies also changes. So even the ones that are always in the blue, so are always subsidized, are receiving different amounts of subsidy. And perhaps this is a better representation of that. I am showing you only conditional on you being subsidized, how much subsidy you receive. So each thin line here is an economic unit. The y-axis is log transformed subsidy amount in Mexican pesos that get deposited to the debit card that you can use to buy fuel and buy fuel only. You cannot use it for anything else, right? You can't go buy popcorn at the store or anything like that, only fuel. And you see basically that there is no horizontal line. A horizontal line would indicate that you're always getting the same amount of subsidy. There's no such thing. Everyone is varying. I've excluded, just for visualization purposes, the cases where you are not subsidized. If I included that, you will see a bunch of lines jutting down from whatever level they are to 0 and then back up. Well, log 0 doesn't exist, right? But they would be NAs, basically. So I'm going to take 3 different sources of data. First, Mexico's VMS data and Mexico's landing database, and combine them to generate 3 outcome variables by economic unit. Initially by vessel, but I'm going to have to group them by economic unit. I'm going to focus on the hours spent fishing, the area of your fishing grounds, and your landings. Now, anytime area and trawling are mentioned together, people start thinking about carbon and sediment disturbance and things like that. That is not the point about this. This actually, you wouldn't be able to do any analysis of that with this. All I'm trying to say is, when you get a subsidy, do you spend more time fishing or do you go to new fishing areas, right? So yes, I'm going to measure in square kilometers, but it has nothing to do with area trolls or sediment perturbation or anything like that, and it shouldn't be, especially how I'm building the area metrics. So that out of the way. We're then going to combine that with a roster of subsidy allocations from 2011 to 2019 that was compiled by Causa Natura, which is a Mexican NGO that sort of promotes openly accessible data and has been behind a lot of the push to make all the data that I'm using available, and Conapesca, where there are 421 economic units, right? So you can see that there's about 1,000 vessels or 1,100 vessels and 400 economic units. That tells you that some economic units have more than one vessel. And then we're also going to bring some other information like the price of fuel on any given year. And Mexico is one of those weird countries that the price of fuel was controlled by the government for many, many years. So whether you were in, basically you would go out to the street and every single gas station, which only were owned by Pemex, the national oil company, would have the same price, right? So there was no price variation. And things like the Niño 3.4 index as a measure of environmental variation. And we're going to build a panel of subsidy allocations and fishing activity for the industrial Mexican shrimp troll fleet. So a panel is repeated observations of each of these economic units through time.
Sorry, Juan Carlos, before you get
Yep.
too far, did you, so you said that 1,100 of those shrimp trawlers, but 421 economic units. Do you have a sense of, how many of those boats are in the economic units, or are all the boats subsidized somehow or another?
No, they are not. And I have a panel at the end, well, a plot in the end. If I remember correctly, there are about 35 economic units that never received a subsidy in the time frame observed. I don't remember exactly how many boats each of those economic units had, but we basically see all the vessels that have a transponder and that are on the vessel registry.
So the 1,100 trawlers belong in the 421 economic units?
Yes,
Okay.
all of them. Yeah, for all the 1,100 trawlers, I can find who owns them and how much subsidy they are getting and how much they are catching and what they are doing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So with this data, I'm going to leverage 3 identification strategies. First, I'm going to try to estimate what's the effect of subsidy on activity. So whether you receive a subsidy or whether you lose a subsidy, depending on how you see it, on your activity. For that, we're going to exploit the massive removals and reductions during 2014. But this is only going to allow us to estimate the effect of removal relative to reductions, right? Because unfortunately, our control group, even though they didn't have their subsidies removed, they had that reduced. So there's 2 things changing there. So it's not super useful, but it's something we can do, and I'm going to do that. The second thing is that we're going to exploit the entry and exit from roster, basically asking, when you do receive a subsidy, do you fish more than when you don't receive a subsidy? Controlling for a bunch of environmental variation and vessel or economic unit fixed effects and things like that. And then in the end, I'm going to calculate the elasticity of activity and output, so fishing hours, area, and landings, with regards or with respect to the subsidy amount. So conditional on you being subsidized, what is the effect of a 1% increase in the baseline subsidy amount on your activity? Now, I saw an email Lichi sent me saying equations are more than welcome, but I had already not prepared my slides with equations, so this is how you get. I'm going to be using 2-way fixed effects estimation for the whole thing. And I'll try to explain whenever I present you some other estimates for comparison, like what happens when you change your specification. I'll try to be clear about those things. But the main specification is a 2-way fixed effects estimation. And this is 2-way fixed effects thinking in econometrician terms rather than ecology terms, because there seems to be some disparity in the lingo there. Okay, so on the top, I'm just showing you that bar chart of how many economic units are subsidized as a reminder of what I'm exploiting here. This graph is showing you the time series of mean fishing activity measured in log hours by vessels that have their subsidies removed, blue 1, in 2014, and vessels that didn't have their subsidy removed in 2014, but that were subsidized in 2011, 2012, and 2013, and 2014, but reduced in 2014, right? The important thing is that the red and blue lines are basically parallel leading to 2014. And then you see kind of a little wedge. So basically the blue one drops more than the red, right? And if you squint at it here, and I'm showing you the mean of a logged variable across many economic units. But this is only to show you sort of what the underlying data look like. When we perform the two-way fixed effects estimation, and this is known as an event study plot, each coefficient is interpreted as the effect of removing relative to the effect of reducing based on the baseline consumption levels of 2013 by the vessels that had their subsidy reduced. The main point is that hours in 2014 decreased by about 15% for vessels that have their subsidy removed relative to the decrease observed for vessels that had their subsidy reduced, okay? The area is also decreasing in about 13%, but look at those confidence intervals, they're huge. And this is actually going to be more clear as I walk through the next slide. And the landings decreased by about 7.5% relative to the vessels that were not, did not have their subsidy removed. Now, here are some details down here. The treated economic units are the ones that had their subsidy removed, and there's 67 of them in 2014. And the control economic units had their subsidies reduced but not removed, and it's 194 of them. And I'm controlling for things like engine size, number of different vessels that an economic unit might have, or total engine size, like summing engine capacity, and environmental variation. Now, this is not terribly helpful because the interpretation, as you probably saw me struggling through it, it's not useful, right? If you're a policymaker, you're like, what do you mean reduction relative to, or removal relative to reduction? That's not helpful. I want to know how much less fishing there will be if I remove the subsidies. And that's why when we move into the entry and exit from the roster analysis. In this case, I'm going to exploit the entirety of the panel, going and looking at how you behave when you have a subsidy versus when you don't have a subsidy, accounting for vessel characteristics, economic unit characteristics, environmental variation, and economic unit and year fixed effects. So the main sample, right, excludes economic units that are never subsidized, and that's 35, and vessels that are always subsidized. Because if you're never subsidized and you're always subsidized, then you're not having any variation, right? So I'm going to exclude them from the main specification, although I include them then in the full specification that you'll see here. Oh, I see a raised hand.
Yeah, there is someone.
Go ahead.
Hang on, let me, I can see if I can let you unmute.
Oh, I allowed them.
Oh, okay, cool.
I think I did.
Yeah, Elizabeth, you're welcome to unmute, or you can type it into the chat.
Well, maybe they are typing.
Yeah.
So while that happens, I'll keep going, but I'll keep an eye on the screen.
Okay. Well, I guess before you go too far down, I just wanted to confirm. So for the previous slide,
Yeah.
so you were only looking at 2011 to 2014. That's like a pretty short time series. And I guess, you know, if you really squint at the landings, they were already going down-ish, 2011.
Yeah.
And so, you know, is there, it kind of looks like number of hours were going up and then landings are going down, which is kind of, you know, am I interpreting that correctly?
It doesn't necessarily mean that landings were going up. It means that the difference in hours were going up, means that the difference in hours for the 67 economic units relative to the 194 economic units was closing. So the gap was closing, right?
Okay.
In relative to 2013. Or so the gap was bigger relative to 2013, smaller. And of course, as you get closer to a year because of many different factors, those should be closer together.
Okay. Yeah, Elizabeth, can you put down your hand? So yeah,
I think it's
type in the chat as needed.
All right, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so entry and exit from the roster. I want you to look at the triangle, because a triangle is a two-way fixed effects main sample, right? And you see that for hours, for area, and for landings. For hours, it's about a 28% increase in fishing hours when you receive a subsidy relative to when you don't. About a 13% increase in area, but again, look at the confidence intervals and take that with a pinch of salt. And landings is about a 60% increase. Now, the other two markers, the circle uses controls. In this case, for example, I remove the year fixed effects, but I include environmental variation in the form of the Niño 3.4 index, because it's collinear with the year fixed effects, right? There's only one Niño index per year across all the regions. And the price of fuel was constant within a given year across all the regions. And the full sample, I include every single data, every single vessel or an economic unit, and again, bring the two-way fixed effects estimation. So this to show that, yes, there is some amount of environmental variation that is accounted for with the Niño 3.4 index and with the price of fuel in terms of your ability to fish or your cost of fishing. But the two-way fixed effects estimation does a pretty good job in and on itself. And again, the treatment is receiving subsidy. Now, the third and final insight of this is the elasticity estimation. And this is because small variations in the subsidy amount might lead to small or large variations in how much you fish, right? So in this case, what we're doing is sorry, I'm going to hide that, is leveraging the variation that you get year to year. So we're going to focus only on vessels that are subsidized, right? And as conditional you being subsidized, do you fish more if your subsidy is bigger? And do you fish less if your subsidy is smaller? And the answer is yes, with a few caveats, right? Again, I'm not including here a full sample estimation because we can only estimate the elasticity for vessels that are subsidized. So if you were never subsidized, I cannot estimate your elasticity to a subsidy. So it's only restricted to vessels that are always or sometimes subsidized. And the main takeaway is that hours increase by about 0.1%. So a 1% increase in the subsidy amount, a 1% increase in the amount deposited to your bank account leads to about a 0.1% increase in your fishing activity in hours. Area seems to kind of increase by 0.07, but look at what happens when instead of using year fixed effects, I try to control for environmental variation on the price of fuel, and also look at how wide those confidence intervals are. So to me, this is all indicative, this and the previous two slides, that when vessels get a subsidy and have the option of finding new fishing grounds or hammering the fishing grounds that they're already using, they decide on the latter, right? With maybe some adjustment for area, but not really, at least not detectable here. And that landings, a 1% increase in subsidies leads to about a 0.15% increase in landings. Now, these last two slides, the effect of entry and exit from the roster and the marginal adjustments from changes in the subsidy amount, allow us to do something interesting. This is a time series of the total fishing hours by the entire fleet from 2011 to 2019. So we can then start to ask, if you believe the estimates as causal, because they are as if random, the entries and exit from the roster are as if random, and the amount that you receive of a subsidy is kind of random because it depends on budgetary constraints from the government, not anything about my ability to fish. Then you can ask who was subsidized and who wasn't subsidized in any given year, right? So we know that for the ones that were not subsidized in red, removing subsidies shouldn't have an effect. So let's get that out of the way first. And then ask if you had removed the entirety of the subsidies in a given year, how much less fishing effort would you have observed? And we can do that, right? Because we know in each year who was subsidized, we know your characteristics, and we know what the coefficient estimate is. So we can go in and say, well, you would have fished X% more. And so in summary, annually, between 20.6 and 27.6% of fishing hours are attributable to subsidies. right? This doesn't tell us anything about fishing mortality. Smart people, like people in that room, might be able to do something with that and the landings information. You can do the same sort of analysis for the landings data. The numbers vary between 50 and 60% of total landings are attributable to subsidies. But because we have the elasticity and because fully removing subsidies is not likely to be a palatable policy, CONAPESC in this case, or fisheries management agencies might consider reducing subsidies. And we can use that elasticity to say, well, if you were to reduce the subsidy by 10, 30, 50, 70, or 90%, these are the wedges that you would expect to chip out from the fishing effort, right? And you can say, well, if in 2017 we had subsidized 50% in terms of amount of what we did, how much less effort would we have expected to observe? We can say something about this. Now, this is looking at the temporal dimension. We can also look at it in the spatial dimension, because as it turns out, since we already established that not everyone is subsidized in the same way, and not everyone fishes in the same places, you have some heterogeneity on where the subsidy is actually being allocated, right? And this is something we hadn't been able to do before. Understand who is subsidized and where that vessel is fishing as a result of the subsidy. So on the left, I'm showing you a map of fishing activity by all the Mexican shrimp trawlers in 2019. You can see that there are a couple hotspots of activity, and that those hotspots might or might not correspond to hotspots of subsidized effort. For example, here on the right, I'm showing you the percent of fishing effort in a given grid cell that is attributable to the subsidy. And you see that a lot of the effort in the Alacranes Reef off of Campeche is done by vessels that never received a subsidy. So were you to remove subsidies, you wouldn't expect to see an effect or a benefit to the fisheries operating in Campeche, but you might expect to see a huge effect for the fisheries operating in the upper Gulf of California, right, where most of the shrimp fisheries operate in Mexico anyway. So the main result from this part is that block subsidies that in principle don't have a marginal effect can actually incentivize overfishing. And we've showed this for Mexican shrimp trawlers. We showed what we can expect from reforming fuel subsidies. We would expect, in this case, a reduction of about 20%, roughly speaking from different estimates. No real change in the extent of the fishing grounds, and a reduction of about 53% in landings. Now, these are all immediate estimates, right? Of course, it's a dynamic system. If you're fishing less, the biomass might rebound and your catches might go up. That's a separate issue, right? We cannot predict the future and say that landings are going to be 53% lower for the remaining of eternity. We're just going to say, well, the year that you do that, landings are going to decrease by this much. And we can talk about where we would expect to see this change, which stocks and which species are subject to subsidized effort and which ones aren't. And that might be useful for policymakers and fishery managers in Mexico seeking to understand what the potential impacts of subsidy reform might be. And I think I am out of time. Is that correct, Lichi?
Yeah, you have about 16 minutes left.
This one is shorter, but 16 minutes would leave zero time for any single question. So I would rather leave it at this and just say that the other part that I was going to talk about is part of work by Nur Arafed Almao, who's a postdoc here in my lab, and Fio, who's my advisor, and it's part of the work I've been doing in my postdoc, which I wanted to present, but it doesn't seem like there's enough time to go through the small-scale fisheries and heatwave stuff. So I'll probably just leave it at that then.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for your talk. That was cool. Yeah, so anybody want to ask any questions, you can raise your hand and I'll allow you to talk, and you can unmute or you can post it in the chat. I guess I can start. I was wondering how, like expecting areas to increase, right? With the subsidies, that would imply that the fishermen would have to go and explore new areas or to find, but that's it's not just a matter of cost, it's also time, right? So it's it's time that they could be fishing in places they know that have shrimp, versus time searching for shrimp in new areas. And so do you have a sense of, how established the fishing grounds are, or how much actual, they call it prospecting here, I guess, prospecting happens.
Okay. So the main idea to look behind, or to look at the fishing grounds, was so that the space-based analysis could be justified, right? You need to make sure that the footprint is not changing, because if your footprint is changing, then you have two things changing and you wouldn't be able to do that. And I was originally interested in that because there's this idea that, in this case, subsidies, but perturbations can modify the exploration-exploitation trade-off, right? Given a limited budget of time or fuel, because those things might be correlated, how are you going to spend those things? Would I rather go look for other places that might come at a cost initially, but I might find a new pristine fishing ground that nobody has found? Or should I just stick to what I know and fish what I have? I was expecting to see, and there's a bunch of other analysis that I've done at the regional level. I was expecting to see in places where the shrimp trawl fleet is not as widespread, or is not the main fishery, that those would be places where you might expect them to try and explore for different fields or different fishing grounds. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And the corollary of that is that I was expecting places that are heavily fished, like the Gulf of California, where the entire Gulf is a fishing ground, basically. I mean, you can drag almost anywhere, you'll catch something. And it doesn't seem to be the case. Now, there's one other piece of analysis that I want to do, which is basically look at the availability of fishing grounds based on bathymetric current and type of substrate, and ask, are they already using 100% of what's there, right? Because that could be a simple option. Well, you can't expand because you're already at capacity, right? There's no more fishing grounds. You're already using them all. But that has proven a little bit harder due to data limitations in basically the high resolution, like in good enough resolution bathymetric charts for Mexico that would allow me to do this, at least at the Gulf of California level or something like that. So that was a very long-winded answer of saying, well, I expected them to do it sometimes, but I can't prove that they did. So I'm going with, there is not enough evidence to say that they do.
Yeah, I'd imagine, if your economic unit encompassed more than one boat, we see that in the pollock fishery here, is that, there are some companies that own several boats, and then sometimes they'll send one boat out to prospect and then the rest stay. And so I was wondering if there was some way you can break up the economic units, that might be.
Yeah, I can certainly look for that. A simple way to think about this, a measure of distance of cluster distance of all the vessels within an economic unit tells you if they're fishing all together, right? And ask, does that measure of distance change when the economic unit gets a subsidy? Basically, do they send their prospector out? And that would be relatively easy to do. I mean, I have all the data, and let me write that down, because that's actually a great idea. Yeah, because that might be an explanation to, well, at the economic unit level, you don't see the amount of fishing grounds expanding because one vessel went looking, but you're not actually, and maybe the answer was no, there's nothing, and you're not capturing that that margin in here. So I definitely can test for that. That's a great idea. Thanks, Lichi.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there already a conversation going on in Mexico to reform the fuel subsidies? I'm just trying to imagine how that process would work.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The World Trade Organization in June approved, after I think 13 years of debate and resolutions, that all members will remove and they call them damaging subsidies. Fuel is one of them, right? They say, well, under some governments, something like, oh, we'll give you the money to pay for a stock assessment, that's considered a subsidy. We'll keep those out, but definitely fuel is being removed. That's at the global level, and it's part of basically any sustainable development agenda you can think of. Subsidies are there. The second one is that Mexico beat us to the punch. In 2020, it's hard to say because if it's guided by the populist president that we have by AMLO, or by COVID, or actually by some belief about subsidy reforms. But since fishers weren't going out to fish during 2020, and that's also why we've cropped the data to 2019. They said, well, what good is it to have a money in my debit card that I can only use to buy diesel fuel? Like that doesn't do anything for me. So the government terminated the program, and now each fisher, rather than each economic unit, right? If you are a fisher that used to work for an economic unit, but you're a fisher in and of itself, now gets, I'm getting this correctly, about 2,000 pesos deposited to its account. So nobody is getting a fuel subsidy anymore. They're all getting cash transfers directly from the government. And not only they eliminated the fuel subsidy, they eliminated the vessel buyback programs, the new engine programs, the study and research programs. All of those got destroyed, and people were just getting money for being a fisher, basically. I was hoping to do some testing of saying, well, that's actually, the entirety of the fleet got their subsidies removed, but it's hard to do any estimation during 2020 when the markets were so disrupted that you can't disentangle the COVID effect from the subsidy reduction effect. So this is why we're focusing on the pre-time. Now, on other countries, different countries subsidize their fleets in different ways. One collaborator, Jihua from China, when I was presenting this to her, like showing this to her, she said, hey, I'm pretty sure this is how we do it in China too. I'm pretty sure like we have a kink. I don't know what the formula is, but I'm pretty sure this is how it is. In other countries, it's a constant price subsidy, right? So you don't have to pay a tax on the fuel that you buy, or we're going to simply discount the fuel if you can show that you're a fisher. And all of those are supposedly going to be removed or heavily reduced by all these countries that have agreed onto this global treaties and agreements. It's yet to be seen, but I think within the next 2 to 4 years, we're going to start see this happening, at least for fuels.
Is this a paper that we can read?
We're about to submit it.
Okay.
I'm actually working on the crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, because this, I started this about a year ago when I started my postdoc, and it's going to be the first paper to come out. If you are interested in it, I can show you some of the preview of the results, because it's really cool. We're able to use turfs, the way in which fisheries are managed in Mexico, at least in the Baja California Peninsula, for benthic fisheries. And we know for each polygon that you see in the map, those are sort of private polygons. Only an economic unit has access to them. And so we know how much you are catching, where you are catching it, and the environmental perturbations that you have been exposed to dating back to 1980. And using this information, basically leveraging the methods set forth by Chris Free on his historical impacts of global warming paper on fisheries production, replicating the same method, just swapping the y and x variables. We estimate the effect of marine heat waves at a level or a spatial resolution that is relevant to the fishers. That is at the polygon level, rather than like at the stock level or at the grid cell level. We do it at the polygon level. For different fisheries, for lobster, sea cucumber, and sea urchin. As you can think, red means big negative impact. Blue means you're actually catching more, which was interesting to see. There's people that follows, yeah, when heat waves occur, I catch more. Like I find more lobster in my turf, maybe because they're moving through. And we're able to correlate those things to performance indicators of each of these turfs and also biogeographic characteristics. So no, it's not a paper you can read yet, but we're hoping that it will be within 6 to 9 months. And I will make sure to share it with Lychee.
Thank you.
But the cool thing is that, that we can do it at a scale that's relevant to fishers. And that then, because they were interested, I mean, they basically told us, hey, how likely is it to happen again? Like, are we going to be exposed to another blob? So we take those same polygons and we do climate projection on them. and ask what is the probability that conditional on there being a marine heat wave, it'll be at least as bad as what it was during the blob. And there's some interesting results there. Sorry, I didn't have time to go over those.
You just have to come back and give another seminar at some point. So why don't you consider yourself a fisheries scientist?
I don't. I'm an environmental scientist. Just today I'm talking about the fish, but it need not be. I'm actually working with Renato on the piracy paper and a bunch of other things that have nothing to do with fish. But I can't seem to get away from fish and fishers.
Well, if there are any other questions online, feel free to post it. And if not, I guess we can thank Juan Carlos again for your time and for a good talk.
No, thanks everyone. Hopefully it wasn't too boring. And thanks for showing up or watching it later when you get the recordings.
All right, thanks everyone for coming for ClatSem. And yeah, thanks again. Good luck on your move to Miami. And
Thanks.
yeah, all right. We'll see you next week for Autumn Moss. She's a set.
Nice seeing you, Lychee. Goodbye, everyone.
You too. Bye. Say hi to Kat.
I will.